I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am very excited to be joined by Tammy Armstrong, who is a novelist and a poet and has written Pearly Everlasting, which is a book that I have devoured, I guess I would say, over the past few weeks. I have just loved being in this immersive and wonderful world with some incredible characters. So, Tammy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jenna.
So I think the best place to start about this book, and I'm sure this is something that you've talked about many times, but sort of the way that you came to this story and how you decided to write the story of Pearly and of Bruno and of the world of this book.
Okay, so I've always loved animal stories as a kid, the Scholastic book sales, any of those. It was always the animal books I was drawn to. And then back in the early 2000s, I did a PhD in literature and critical animal studies, where I sort of looked at how animals disrupt literature, how when they appear, it changes how we can communicate with each other, or how it sort of puts kind of a light on that sometimes language fails us because we're talking about animals. They communicate, but they communicate in different ways. And so when I finished doing that PhD, I was totally burnt out of academic work. I never wanted to write academically, but I still wanted to write an animal story and take some of that philosophy and some of that reading that I'd done. And so I tried a few different stories and it wasn't really working. And I went down to Maine to visit with my mom, and she had, it was just one of those like free newspapers, free magazines. I think it was called the Downeaster. And they had an excerpt in it from William Underwood's memoir called Wild Brother. And in that, he talks about, he was a photographer, and he heard about this woman who was raising an orphan bear cub with a newborn baby in a lumber camp in Maine in about 1903. And as soon as I just read that, I was like, yes, like this is something. Okay, here we have this is the spark. And then I started thinking about it. It's like, I know Maine quite well. I grew up in a border town. A lot of my family lives there. And I grew up in New Brunswick, and my family worked in lumber camps in the 1930s up until the 1950s or so. So I had some of that lumber camp background. I had the deep woods kind of background. My mom has bears around her house all the time, tearing things down, playing on things. And so they started stacking up into this story. And so the real little girl in Underwood's telling was named Ursula, meaning little bear. And Pearly Everlasting is my little girl that was raised with the bear. And I just wanted to, what would happen if they could be raised together as siblings, and what kind of connection would that be? Because it's, Bruno isn't a pet. He's part of the family. And so that's where that sort of those initial sparks came from. What kind of family would that look like? Deep in the woods, away from everyone, isolated. And
I love that. I remember the first time I saw the book and really started to look and see what it was about. When you just hear it is about a girl and her brother who is a bear. And it kind of gives, you have some preconceived notions about what that could be. But as I was reading, it's so much more tender. And immediately as I was going through, I was like, oh, this is not maybe what I had originally thought. This is something that really is family, and it really is love. And yes, finding that connection between the two of them was just immediately I was like, I'll go wherever this book takes me.
I've had people say, I would die for Bruno.
Truly. I know.
Yeah.
I was
glad.
We got to get Bruno merch. I really was immediately the way that Pearly Everlasting speaks about Bruno and her voice as she just immediately accepts, no, this is her brother. There's no doubt for her.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt for us because we can see that immediately.
Yeah. She never sees him as a pet. And she's really adamant that people don't treat him that way either, that he's his own bear.
And watching the two of them interact, I mean, it's not magical realism, it's not supernatural, but there is something between the two of them that goes beyond what you would, normally anticipate between a person and an animal. I think there's really something strong there between them.
Yeah, I was thinking I really enjoyed writing Bruno, but I had to be really conscious of how I was writing him. I didn't want him to just be goofy, but he is goofy because he's a bear and bears are goofy. And so I started thinking about connections that people have with when they're working with horses or people with service dogs, and also sort of thinking because they have that other level of connection with that animal because they're working with them. And so I watched a lot of interviews with people who did that for a living because it's just a different level of communication. It's not, they're not posing the dog in a purse or something. It's like a different level. It's a respect level that goes beyond just being a cute pet. You can, of course, have respect for your pets. I do, I have dogs, but it's a different level than just, this is my cute dog sitting in a chair.
I think especially too, taking into the context that this is what most people would consider a dangerous animal. There's this inherent difference because we don't cohabitate with bears in that way. We don't have, well, I'm sure there are people that have bears in their homes, but it's probably not, what most people would consider a great idea to have a wild animal that is very strong and can be very large and has all these different, aspects that we wouldn't associate with a domesticated animal. And there is that reaction from some characters of not understanding how Pearly and her family can have this connection. And going through that, you almost forget it at certain points, but there's always something to sort of bring that back to, no, this is an extraordinary circumstance.
Yeah. And I wanted that came in later drafts because I realized I don't want Pearly Everlasting to be a book that's advocating for people to get pet bears. And so I'm like, as she's getting out in the world, people have to question this, like your brother's a bear, like you live with a bear. And for her, she's been so isolated that is not odd, but when she goes out into the outside, then that's when she sees, oh, this isn't, not everyone lives with a bear, I guess. So yeah, and when you're living in a more urban area, which they are when she goes out into towns, that, people are going to ask her about her brother, the bear.
And I love this idea of isolation versus entering into a space of community, even though, I would argue that there are ups and downs to when she enters the outside, and sort of what she finds there, I should say, isn't quite what she expects, but she also has no idea what to expect as she goes on this journey. And to watch her go from this community that she knows so well and this world in which she knows all of the people and she knows the ins and outs of existing in these camps and what it means, and to sort of go out into the world and have to encounter not only people who are acting in ways that she's never encountered before, but just a society that moves at a different pace than what she knows. And watching her navigate that along with Bruno and along with these other people that she knows, it's really, I don't know, it gives you so much to work with as a reader to understand how you would feel or how, to what it reflects back for us.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, she's never used money before. She doesn't know stores. She doesn't know grocery shopping. Everything's brought in from the outside to the camps, and that's where she lives. So I mean, she doesn't know about hot water. She doesn't know about how to turn taps on or anything like that. So it's, in a lot of ways, it's the technology that she's not aware of, but she is aware of kindness and love and family, and that when you're in these camps, you had to look out for each other. They were very dangerous camps. There were a lot of injuries and deaths. And so she's grown up with that sort of protection, but also knowing that, things can happen. So when she's thrown out into the outside, it's very different. And I mean, she's never seen a car before. She's never electrical lights, all of that is very, very new that she has to negotiate. And And she gets very frustrated at times because everyone's like, what do you mean you don't know how to turn on a light?
I had this moment while reading of realizing, sometimes to reorient myself in the time of the book and go, yeah, even at that point, which, is the time when many people, my grandparents were alive, that time, and that there are still people who were living completely outside of society. It's a shock to sort of remember, oh, this isn't that long ago.
No. And if you came from rural New Brunswick in the 30s, I mean, not even being in a lumber camp in the middle of the woods, but just rural areas, they didn't have power everywhere. It was still very, you had like your hand pump well and you grew your own food still. You had to really be pretty self-reliant in a lot of those small communities. The bigger communities were moving faster, like the ones that Pearly ends up being in. But if you're in a rural community, you're still lagging behind.
It gives Pearly this voice that is so unique. When I started reading and sort of getting inside of her head and seeing how she sees the world is so interesting, because she doesn't have these preconceived notions that many people would have from, the radio and magazines and, this contact with the world in this direct way. There's some of that, I think, in her sister, but sort of this direct connection she doesn't have. And so the way she views the world is so unique. And I wonder how it came to be finding her voice, how it came to be writing in her head.
That came from the very beginning when I started, after I had those initial sparks, and I started writing it in the third person. And then I moved it into the first person, and that was her voice. And it came really early on that I was like, she's got to be scrappy and she's got to be funny, because humor is really important when you're growing up struggling and, living in a dangerous environment. And she has a really good heart. I think that's also really important to her, that she doesn't always showy about it, but she'd fight for you if you needed her. She'd have your back.
There's a part where she's describing what we may be able to call an intriguing haircut that she has. And I from that moment, I just could picture it so well. And I loved that sort of that's really showing us who this girl is.
Well, I gave myself a haircut when I was a kid. It became a very intriguing haircut that made my mother cry. So that's where that came from, where I was like, yeah, let's give her, she has some burdocks, she got sprayed by a skunk, and then Bruno also has to get, this hair treatment. So on top of everything else that's happened to her, she has to go into the outside with this very bad haircut.
And you know what? I think everyone can relate on some level to that kind of thing where you're like, this is not how I wanted to go out into this world today. And yet we're doing it.
Yeah. Gonna hold my head up high and go to the store.
Yes. And she does. And I think there's a real earnestness to her, and there's a real resiliency to the way that she faces problems. She just doesn't know any different than to kind of go head on and go into it with being pretty open and being pretty honest. And sometimes that does not work out well for her. She has these moments where, maybe we as reader, you go, oh, why, if you just would have done this or said this, but that's not how she acts. And so sometimes the world can be pretty hard for her.
Yeah. And, growing up in the Maritimes, I've always really appreciated that there is this honesty that, I lived in Vancouver for quite a few years. And sometimes I would meet someone and I'd say, are you from the Maritimes? And they'd say, yeah, how do you know? And it's because they didn't have this sort of polished, this is how we move through the city. They were very, not vulnerable, but they were very much themselves, which I really appreciate. So it's like this, they're not putting on any sort of personality except who they are. And it makes them vulnerable in some ways. And I'm pretty sure when I moved to the city for the first time, I also had it. But it's also something that I really appreciate, because it means that like all your edges haven't been all sanded off, so that you can move through whatever city, that you're maintaining some of your background, you're maintaining some of like that truth in your personality. So that's where some of that came from with her.
And I really enjoyed watching her interact with the myriad of characters that she encounters. There are so many wonderful, like, people whose paths that she crosses that I just really enjoyed, like Songcatcher and Ebony. And I really loved these people that sort of are on the periphery of her life and often are able to help her and to teach her, and sort of watching this tapestry grows as she realizes that her community is maybe bigger than she thought. I really enjoyed getting to get to know them.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, I needed her to have some adults watching out for her a little bit, you can't just send her out into the world with everyone just turning their back. And so I think that they're all great characters in that they let her learn, but then sometimes they're like, hold on, just maybe you don't want to do that, or maybe you need to do this, or at least make suggestions for her to, because she can be quite stubborn. And she's just like, Bruno and I are going to do this. And they're like, well, hold on. Let's just, so I like that they can be a little bit of a voice of reason or guidance, because she can be very hot-headed sometimes with her decisions.
Without giving away too much, because I think the scene is so great, there's I would say a rescue scene that I love very much as I was reading, and just that action and the sort of way that the characters work together to get another one of our favorite characters out of a bind that they have gotten themselves in. I really love that sort of there's so much family and found and chosen family in this that really, those themes of love and connection, whether it's your own family like Pearly and her, her blood family, but also the people that she chooses to make her family. It just gets me as I read.
Oh, I'm so glad that you said that, Jenna, because chosen family was something that I really wanted to emphasize through this, that love of a chosen family is very, very strong. And all those people would do anything for her, and she would do anything for them. And they would do anything for Bruno, too. I mean, they've known him since he was a cub. And even though they don't see the Songcatcher and Ebony that much, because they're traveling through the woods, and they make it to certain camps every year, but there's always that connection, or they're sending a little money, or they're always thinking about Pearly's family. And you can see when they reconnect how happy she is every time she sees them, and how much they care for each other.
And watching all those relationships grow, and Ansel and his connections as he goes through, there's so many great moments. And I wonder what kind of research you had to do to sort of really bring life into all of the circumstances that they find themselves in. I'm sure that you did a lot of research, because there's a lot of great stuff. But it also never feels like you were giving us homework, or that it's too much. Because sometimes I think in historical novels, there can be this urge to know every little thing. But this is just the right amount of atmosphere and info.
Oh, good. Yeah, I've read historical fiction where, like, I know you've done all this research and I appreciate it, but we don't need it all, and I think one of the things with historical fiction and the research is that, like anything, reading all of the research, I have it and I can pull out bits and pieces. So I didn't feel I needed to prove that I had done some research for it. And some of the research, I mean, I read some books on lumber camps. I read some books. I found some interviews. I think one of the cooks, I think he was a Minnesota cook, actually. And so it was like an oral history that he was talking about food that he'd cooked and years he worked in the camps and things like that. And then some of the research would just come in little snippets where I would read something about the King's tree, the lumberjacks who went over in World War I to cut trees, because they needed it for the ducking boards and the trenches and coffins and boxes. And I didn't do a lot of research, but I did find I love oral histories, recordings with elderly people who have, been in. So those are really great for getting some of the dialogue that some of those older lumber camp guys, the fellers and stuff that they have for some of that language that they had. I didn't do overextensive amount of research. I knew some of this anyways because I'm from New Brunswick, so I knew some of the stories, and there really was a circus train that crashed, and so those sort of stories. I'm like, wait a minute, didn't we have a circus? So then I could go back and reread it. I'm like, oh, we did. Okay, like, would this happen here? And it could. So
a lot of the information I think in this feels very lived in versus something super academic. As a Minnesotan, there were so many things that I recognized from, growing up reading about the lumber camps in our own history, or even going, we used to go on like field trips to like fur trading outposts and lumber camps and stuff like that. And a lot of it felt very much like this. And, having that, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, I know exactly what that's like. And even if it's slightly different geographically, I was like, okay, I think I know where all this all goes. And the other thing, as a northern Midwesterner, that felt so real. And I love the descriptions of nature that you're able to use. There are so many of these things that I immediately was like, I know exactly where this is. I know exactly what this feels like. And I think even if I had never been to a forest in that way, I think I still would have been able to get it.
Oh, good. That's good to know. I spent a lot of time as a kid because I grew up in the 70s. So it was like, here's a bag of granola, see you in 4 hours. So I spent a lot of time with my dogs out in the woods. And so that's something that's very familiar to me. And if you went on, just like if you went on school trips, you'd be out into the forest, or you'd go to, a reenactment village from, the 19th century, or you'd visit a blacksmith or something like that who's all dressed up. So, we love all the costumes up here too. So
there is a very hilarious photograph of me and my mother and my grandmother, and we're all wearing a bunch of strange furs. I think I'm holding some sort of musket. I'm like 7. It's just wild. I was like
for de bois.
Yeah, I was like, what are we doing here? But you know what?
Our costumes. So yeah. So yeah, that's where I pulled some of that from.
Yeah, I should put that in the show notes, just so everyone can see my childhood. Going back to the nature, I have to say, I think there's so much there in this sort of immersive experience that we go through as we encounter the ways that nature helps Pearly and Bruno and the ways in which it is an adversary to them. I think that is so important whenever I'm reading something where nature is kind of a character in this. I would say the world that they're encountering is sort of a character, and that, when you're out there in the woods in the middle of nowhere, 1 second something can be helpful, like a stream or a river, and the next second it's dangerous and it's there against you. And I think that really comes through in this.
Yeah, having her grow up in that world, she understands a bit about navigating through the woods. And we sort of forget that back in the 30s, you could have 6, 8, 10 feet of snow in the woods. I mean, it was, it was huge. Now we think, a couple of feet of snow because the climate changing. But back then they were snowed in for a long time. So you don't know what's underneath that. You don't know, she's navigating on snowshoes. So she has to, have some idea. I mean, and sometimes the New Brunswick woods are very, very thick and tangly. So, I mean, just negotiating through those woods is difficult and exhausting, exhausting to try to make a few miles every day is really hard for her.
I also love the way that because of this sort of otherworldly experience she has living isolated in this lumber camp, we get something which I love in sort of this era of writing, which is a lot of these really interesting sort of mythologies and like personal folklores that come through. We've got this old Jack, that runs through, and we've got the songs that they sing, and there's so much specific history that I love to see represented in literature, because I feel like we don't see as much of these people, and they're sort of the I guess there's sort of a class piece of it too, as well, that it's a lot of these specific era, maybe a lower socioeconomic class or a working class mythology that I love.
Yeah, and it's fascinating with the character Songcatcher. She's loosely inspired by Helen Creighton, who was a folklorist and a song collector here, and so she collected, like, I don't know, some 4,000 songs, and some of them were, they were from Acadians and from African Americans, African Canadians, German, English, Mi'kmaq. So she really tried to keep some of those, preserve them. And she also collected ghost stories and superstitions. And my family came from Cape Breton. My great-grandmother came from Cape Breton, and she still spoke Gaelic. And those superstitions were very much alive when I was a kid. Like, you were not going to put your laundry out on the line Christmas Day, or, if there were birds at the window, my family would be like, oh, that's not a good sign. So some of those superstitions were still around, and I grew up with a lot of those, and I just always enjoyed that they were these very strange sometimes. And so that was some research that I did enjoy doing, that looking at the superstitions, various ones, and cures, like, here, boil this nail in some milk and you'll feel better, or drink this gunpowder.
Yeah, some of those, I would say, rustic medicinal vibes. I was like, ooh, yeah. I mean, of course, there are definitely things that they were doing to cure and to heal that make a lot of sense. There's so much in that sort of using natural things.
Yes.
Things they'd find that really do work and spawned an entire, type of medicine. But there's also some things where I'm like, uh-oh, if I had a broken leg, I might be a little worried in some of those moments.
Yeah, I don't think this is probably going to help.
And that's the danger. I mean, again, that inherent danger as she's, seeing her mother and learning from her mother about these different things, and then watching these men in the lumberyard, especially as a character who I have some personal beef with, a personal vendetta against, comes in and makes some changes that really affect the camp as a whole. To watch that sort of shift from this more idyllic life that she knew, where there were still hardships, but she knew how it was going to go, into a world that she wasn't quite, when her home and her life turned for the worse.
Yeah. Yeah. And this was before unions, this was, and it was really, there were some unions that were starting, but lumber camps were notoriously difficult to unionize, because you have a bunch of just wanderers, really. I mean, I remember reading in one of the books for research that some of the lumber guys in Maine, when they finished in the woods, they had to go to the county jail because they'd been in trouble the year before, but they needed to work. And so they had to do 2 weeks in the jail for something they had done the summer before. A lot of them would be out carousing and spending all their money, and then they'd go back to the woods. They weren't really like family men. A lot of them were, kind of just wanderers. And so when you bring in a camp boss that is shorting them every day and taking money from them and making them work harder, then, injuries. And that's sort of, before that, she had good camp bosses. And so, yeah, she's not aware of that greed that wasn't part of her world before Swicker comes to town.
And sort of this concept of greed versus generosity, or greed versus, a more open, or a more, it's a drilling down of what almost feels like good versus evil for Pearly. It comes from, that is the direct connection for her between this life of community and connection versus understanding money and understanding greed and people that steal or people that short you. It really, I think, sets her down a path of trying to grapple with this bigger issue.
Yeah, and she's still, she's a teenager, so things are a little bit more black and white for her. And she doesn't see those nuances because she's never had a chance to see greed as a nuance. She just sees it as Zwicker came to the camp and suddenly all these people are being injured and people are angry and they're not getting paid as much. And then when she goes to the outside world, then she sees that with the Broad family, who is the rich family in town, and how because the depression's still on, so everyone's still struggling. Some are struggling more than others.
I love the sort of the back and forth that's able to create in her, and that it really allows her to make choices that help her learn who she is. I think by the end, even though she's still very young, she's coming to understand really what's important, and she's able to seek out other people and situations that are in line with that, in those values. And by the end, I'm not going to give anything away, but it really there's this moment where you're like, oh, I think things are going to be okay. And that's always what I want. I leave every book going, I just hope everyone's.
I do too. I wonder if they're okay. I don't know. Yeah, there's a scene where I think it's the second year when Zwicker, the camp boss, comes to town, and he brings these two nasty German shepherds with him, and they end up running into Pearly's cabin and attacking Bruno. And then Zwicker sort of tries to just calm everything down by giving everyone a bottle of Coca-Cola. She takes it, and her dad is he doesn't say anything, but he's saying, no, I don't want anything to do with this camp boss who treats people very badly. As she realizes after she takes it, she's drinking it with Bruno and it doesn't taste very good and she doesn't like it. And she realized what she's done is that she sold herself out for a bottle of pop. And it's sort of one of those learning moments that she realizes, you need to, those sort of decisions, even though it seems like a simple thing, it's not. It has a bigger meaning that, Zwicker is treating people badly, and you need to, by refusing that bottle of pop, then you are making your stand in a quiet way. And so she, afterwards, she I think she gives it all to Bruno because she's just like, no, that was the wrong thing to do.
And she'll have those moments again and again. And it seems like every time it's, she's able to stand a little bit more in her convictions, and she's able to make those things. Also, I have to say, I appreciate that you call it pop, because that is correct. And I think Minnesota is like the only state that says that. But I will say that is the correct word for it. I have to move on to one of my favorite questions and one of my favorite things to talk about, which is some of your literary influences and some of the things that have shaped you as a writer and some of the things that you love to read.
Okay. As soon as you ask a writer that, their mind goes blank.
I know. Oh, I know. It's one of it's a little torturous, but I get to do it every time. So,
who do I like? I really enjoy a lot of Southern writers. I enjoy Robert Olmsted. I think he's a wonderful writer. Shirley Jackson is someone I come back to. I think every time I have a problem with a character that's kind of a troublesome character, I turn to her, because she's so good at these characters that they're not doing anything really wrong, but you just get a bad vibe about them. She's so good at that. It's just this, you get this feeling from her characters. I love Elizabeth Bowen. Her short stories. She's so great with atmosphere. I think I've learned a lot from how she sets up moving, and she tends to write a lot in houses, which I love. So she moves you through houses in a certain way, and just the things that she'll settle your focus on. And I read a lot of her with Pearly moving to the Pruse house, because the house is so important for her stay there. Who else do I like? I don't know. I like Faulkner. I turn to Faulkner a lot. I'm looking at my books here to see what else do I. Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping. I probably read that once a year. I think that's just such a marvelous book. So I have books that I read because I think the characters, a writer does something so well with characters, and sometimes it's so much with atmosphere. Sometimes it's just language. I mean, I would never sit down and read all of Blood Meridian again, I don't think. I think I'm okay with that. But I will pick it up and flip it, because I think it's poetry in a lot of it, scary poetry. But the language is just so torqued, and I really appreciate that. So, and sometimes, I just like to read books that have which are more about language, like Tolkien language, like William Gass, I think is really interesting. Kevin Barry, I think he does really great job with language. Yeah, so I guess it depends what I'm sort of looking for.
I think people will find a lot of those things in Pearly Everlasting. If they're looking for atmosphere, if they're looking for language, if they're looking for characters, they've got it.
They've got it.
And one of my other favorite questions, which is sometimes not anyone else's favorite question, is what are you working on now? Are there things on the horizon that we can look forward to?
I've just finished short story collection that I worked on during the pandemic, and I have just finished a new manuscript for a novel that are with my agent right now, which involves maybe a lake monster.
Well, that is intriguing, and I think that we'll all be waiting very patiently. Of course, we can wait patiently, but it sounds like there is something exciting there. Well, Tammy Armstrong, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about Pearly Everlasting. I know I will be thinking about Bruno for a long, long time, and I can't wait for readers to be able to meet him as well.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Good talking to you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.